Hey, all right, we're going to look at another John Donne poem, another metaphysical poem, Holy Sonnet 10. This is maybe, including Sir Philip Sidney's work, the most complicated piece of writing that we've looked at this year. Um, it's got tons of things going on. Uh, Remember that John Donne's wife died. He became a clergyman. He joined the church, and he ended up writing a series of sonnets called Holy Sonnets. This is the most famous of them, which he wrote on his deathbed. He was in the process of dying himself when he wrote this one. And it ends up being addressed to death and about the concept of death, the metaphysical idea of what does it mean to die. And anybody who's wondered about that, you get John Donne's ruminations, which are pretty strong and interesting right here in Holy Sonnet 10. So first off, it's called Holy Sonnet 10. Sonnets are about love. This is part of a series of sonnets that were about the love of God. Although this one doesn't really say anything particular about that. It's maybe a little bit of a stretch to call it about the love of God. But let me read what it says, and then we'll make sure it's a sonnet, and then we'll go through and do all the things that we did with our other sonnet analyses, and then talk about it. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and does with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Okay, well, that's pretty bold. Let's look. Do we have iambic pentameter? Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Yeah. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow. Yeah, it's not as good an iambic pentameter as, say, Sidney and Spencer, but it is iambic pentameter. You might be a syllable off here or there. Donne was never the greatest in terms of his meter. But let's look at rhyme scheme. We got the, obviously it's your first one, so it's going to be an A. Then we got so, which does not rhyme with the, so it's a B. Overthrow is a B. Me goes with thee, so you got A, B, B, A. That's the same way that Petrarch opened up his sonnets. B is another A. Flow is a B. Go is a B. Delivery goes with B, so it's an A. So that's an octave. You can already tell. And so it's set up with 8 lines in an octave, just the way Petrarch, the first sonnet writer ever, would write them. Now let's look at the rest of this. Men is a C, because it doesn't rhyme with anything that came before. Dwell is brand new. That's a D. Well is a D. Then is a C. Eternally, me, B. Delivery. I mean, you might be tempted to call that an A, but die is entirely different. And I think, due to the vowel shift, and you see it in a number of other poems. So I think you kind of have to read more poems to get it. You've got eternal lie would have been the way they pronounced it, and die. So you got an EE. So essentially what you got is an octave, 8 lines. You got a quatrain, 4 lines, and you got a couplet that resolves it at the end and ends it. Other interesting things about this poem. Actually, let me pause this, open up a new document we can talk about. If we look at the sonnet, it starts out with the line, death be not proud, though some have called thee. Thee means you, like you mighty and dreadful, for you are not so. So he's talking to death, the idea of death, maybe personified death as the Grim Reaper. So the first thing that you probably note here is that this poem is an apostrophe. Oops, is that not going to write? Let's try this again. right? Talking to something that cannot respond. Death can't respond, but he's talking directly to death. The poem is addressed to death as a concept, as an idea. There's probably the allusion, if I could just type, the allusion to the Grim Reaper as sort of the image of death. He's clearly doing that as well. We know this is a sonnet, but any poem that is about death or the shortness of life is also an elegy. We also know that because it's John Donne and it's about a concept and it uses a lot of metaphors and even a conceit, it is a metaphysical poem. So we've got, I guess this doesn't really belong. We've got a poem that fits, 4 different sort of poetry categories. It's an apostrophe, a sonnet, an elegy, and a metaphysical poem all at once. Let's go back to our sonnet here. So, death, be not proud, though some have called you mighty and dreadful. So the idea here is that death shouldn't be proud of itself. That death, the Grim Reaper tends to be something that all human beings are afraid of. And because of that, death theoretically has a reason to be proud, but it shouldn't be, because it is not mighty and dreadful. So he just calls out death. He opens it up. He's like, death, you're not mighty and dreadful. I know you think you are, but you're not. Then he gives us some reasons. He says, for those you think you do overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet can you kill me. This seems like a bad idea. Like he's on his deathbed and he's like, you can't kill me, death, bring it. Okay. What does he mean here? This seems like a paradox right off the bat, that the people that death kills don't really die, and that death can't even kill John Donne. But they do, right? Like they're dead. How can this be true? Well, remember, John Donne at this point in his life has been an Anglican pastor, an Anglican minister for a long time. And, he believes in the eternal afterlife. And so obviously we've got some religious connections going on right off the bat. This idea that, death can't really kill us. In a religious sense, you're like, okay, well, maybe death kills your body, but it can't kill your soul. And there's this eternal life kind of a thing. Okay. I sort of buy that. I get where he's going. But it is pretty bold of him. The other thing I guess we want to talk about before we jump into the rest of the poem is you can already tell that, the tone of this poem is interesting. It's got sort of a mocking or dismissive tone towards death. I mean, you generally don't treat death in this way, but right now he's already calling death poor death, like, oh, you poor baby death, right? Like, so he's sort of mocking or laughing at, in some way, making fun of the idea of death. They die not, poor death, nor yet can you kill me. It's sort of challenging death as well. So then he moves into the second half of the quatrain, and here comes your conceit. From rest and sleep, which but your pictures be, much pleasure, then from you much more must flow. And this idea of death being sleep is going to continue and develop throughout the poem, but the idea here is the conceit is, remember, a conceit is comparing an abstract idea or emotion to a concrete object or an everyday experience. The everyday experience in this case is sleep. So death is just a big sleep, right? And you can see that here. From rest and sleep, which but your pictures be. That's a metaphor within a metaphor, that, basically when we sleep, it is a picture of death. Death is the reality and sleep is the picture. So the idea here is that whenever we go to sleep, we experience sort of a little or a minor death. The death of the end of each day is when we go to sleep at night. But guys, sleep is a good thing, John Donne says. We look forward to sleep. At the end of a long day, we're like, God, it's been a long day. I can't wait to go to sleep. And John Donne is trying to change our perspective on death. He wants, people at the end of a long life to be like, hey, it's been a long life. It's time to die, right? And to look forward to death, because we look forward to sleep. We look forward to the end of the day and moving on to the next day. And Donne says, if much pleasure comes from rest and sleep, then think about, if death is just a big sleep, how much more pleasure must come from death. than we get from sleep. And then, to back this argument up, he says, and soonest our best men with thee do go. It's that idea of only the good die young, right? He's changing the way people think about death. He's like, stop thinking about death as a punishment. Death's a reward. The good die young as a reward for their goodness. They're not punished for their goodness. They get to go to heaven. They get to be in heaven in the afterlife. Rest of their bones and souls delivery. Their soul is delivered, to heaven. So that's sort of a change. And actually, this is interesting. Don't think of death as a punishment. Think of death as a reward. It's a really, really interesting concept. Actually, I had an interesting conversation with my wife about the topic of death. I know it sounds morbid, doesn't it? But the reality is that she has kidney disease, and right now my brother donated a kidney to her, and so she's doing well. But for a couple of years, things looked pretty bad. Like her kidney was failing, and then she ended up on dialysis, and I had to learn how to administer dialysis to her here at home, and she was in a lot of pain, and it was not pleasant for her. But she had this epiphany. She said that lots of people say they want to die in their sleep, or they want to die quickly and not know. And she said, actually, the thing about being in pain is that, if you die in a car accident, or if you just go to sleep and you die, you're sort of robbed of the rest of your life. But if you're in chronic illness, death is actually a release. It can be welcome as opposed to feared or jarring. And that's an interesting concept, because certainly John Donne had been ill for a while and was on his deathbed when he wrote this, and it sort of dovetails with that conversation that we had. And so she's decided that she wants her death to be I don't know if slow and painful is the way to say it, but that she wants to be in pain so that it doesn't feel like she's being robbed of her life. She feels like she's being released, which is an interesting concept. Deep conversations English teachers have, I guess. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Then he sort of changes. We change topics. Now, we ended the octave, and this octave is pretty consistent. And then we go to a quatrain, and the quatrain has a new idea. It throws a metaphor in here. Thou is you, right? Art is are. So you are slave. So the idea, death is a slave. Now, this is an interesting concept. We tend to think of death as sort of its own master. It's a big, scary thing. But he says death is a slave to fate, as I'll list, chance, kings, and desperate men, and does with poison, war, and sickness dwell. So the idea here that Donne is trying to get across, I think, is we all think death is scary. Death isn't scary. Death is a release. Death doesn't kill you. Chance kills you. You get in a car accident. It wasn't death who killed you. It was random chance. Kings kill you. Political leaders may start a war and conscript you, and you go off and you fight in this war and you die. It wasn't death that killed you. It was kings. Desperate men. A murderer might kill you. Poison might kill you. War might kill you. Sickness might kill you. These are the things to fear. Don't fear death. Fear cancer. Don't fear death. Fear murder. These are the ones who control death. Death is their slave. Death does their bidding. Death has no agency. Death can't do anything without an agent, without some outside thing. And that's the thing to fear. Don't fear dying. Fear being shot. Right? And so he's changing it up. Now, again, the mocking tone that we had earlier continues here. He calls death a slave. Death is nothing to fear. Death is simply the release at the end of the event. And in that way, it's a good thing. He says, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well. This word poppy is a reference to the plant from which comes opium. So he's talking about drugs here. He's like, and first we said if sleep is good, then death is better. And he's like, if drugs are good and then drugs make you sleep, then death is maybe even better than that. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than your stroke. Why swellest thou then? So the rhetorical question here is, why do you think you're so big and bad, Death? if you have no agency, if you can't do anything, if you can't even kill me, and if you can't take souls, you can only take bodies. And so he brings it down to a final couplet. So ideally, he's up to this point, he's asked you to challenge your conception of death and your fear of death, and given you some reasons to think differently about death itself. Now he's going to drop this ending couplet, which theoretically is going to change the course of your thoughts entirely. He says, "One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, you shall die." Now that's a paradox, this idea that death is going to die. Death can't die, right? It's death. It's a metaphorical concept. It's the end of our life. How does death die? Well, we've got to jump into Christian religion of the Renaissance here a little bit to understand this. Remember, John Donne's an Anglican preacher. He says, "One short sleep past, we wake eternally." Well, that idea of one short sleep past, we got to understand a little bit of theology. So back in the day, they used to believe in this thing called limbo. Like the idea was that when you died and you were buried, your soul sort of went into limbo. And it didn't matter whether you died 4,000 years ago or like the day before Judgment Day. But on Judgment Day, the day that Jesus comes back and the earth is judged, everybody who is dead is going to wake up. All of their souls are going to awake as if from a sleep. And it won't matter how long you've been asleep. It'll feel like the same amount of time. Like, you ever go to sleep at night and you like blink and then you wake up and you're like, oh, what happened to my night? That's how it's going to be. Everybody, doesn't matter how long you've been dead. It will feel like you closed your eyes and you just opened them and you woke up, and it's going to be Judgment Day, and then you're going to wake eternally and you're going to go get judged. And when you get judged, you'll either ascend to heaven or go to hell, but whatever the case, your soul is eternal and can't die. And so death really just puts you to sleep. It connects back to its central conceit, the idea that death is like sleep. We just go to sleep for a brief time. Death kills your body and puts your soul to sleep, and then your soul wakes to eternity, and death shall be no more. And the interesting thing about this metaphor is that the only thing that actually dies when your physical body dies, if you believe in the idea of eternal soul, is the idea of death itself. Because if your soul is eternal, once your body dies, you cannot die. So what really happens, Donne says, is that when death kills your body, he really kills the concept of death. In a sense, when you die, death commits suicide. Because you can't die again. Which is sort of like this crazy metaphysical idea. But that's sort of where he goes at the end of the poem. And so he's like, yeah, if you believe in eternity, if you believe in an eternal soul, if you believe in heaven, then death shouldn't scare you. Death is a release from the pain and the trouble of your life, and it wakes you up to eternity. And so really, death kills himself. Weird sort of idea, but strong and powerful, and maybe changes your perspective on death and the fear of death, which I think is what John Donne wants to do. And maybe he's saying it as much for himself and his approaching journey to the next stage of life as he is for anybody that he wrote for. But let's read this thing again and appreciate what John Donne has done here. I'm not going to go through and do sound devices or anything like that. I feel like we've done that enough. But look at all the metaphors, look at all the figurative language, think about the metaphysical nature of this poetry. I wanted this to be about 20 minutes, and I think I've got it. So, death, be not proud, though some have called you, and I'm gonna modernize this just when I'm gonna start over, but I'll modernize it. I'll turn all the old words into new words so you can sort of hear it hit the way it's supposed to hit. It messes up the rhyme scheme a little bit, but whatever. So, Holy Sonnet 10 by John Donne. Death, be not proud, though some have called you mighty and dreadful, for you are not so. For those whom you think you do overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet can you kill me. From rest and sleep, which but your pictures be, much pleasure, then from you much more must flow. And soonest our best men with you do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. You are a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and do with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And pomp your charms can make us sleep as well, and better than your stroke. Why swellest you then? one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, you shall die. John Donne, Holy Sonnet 10.